Blog Talk Radio.
Fulfill Radio, a voice you can trust. Broadcasting live presents Two Guys and a Bible with Don Preston and William Bell. Join us each week at 7 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Central as we bring you exciting, sound, challenging, and comforting messages regarding the end times. Thank you for tuning in today. Don Preston is the founder of Preterist Research Institute, or PRI. Don is a prolific author, having written and published 19 books, a host of audio and DVD studies, and is a debater and defender of the full preterist view. His websites are BibleProphecy.com, Eschatology.org, and DonKPreston.com. William Bell is the founder of AllThingsFulfilled.com Ministries and has a website bearing the same name, and has authored 3 books, audios, and DVDs. He has published hundreds of articles and recordings. And now, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Two Guys and a Bible broadcast with Don Preston and William Bell. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Two Guys and a Bible right here on Fulfill Radio, a voice you can trust. I am William Bell, and with me is Dr. Don Preston. And we are excited to be back with you for another week of study and dialogue about the Word of God and those things that pertain to the time of the end. Don, how are you doing today?
Doing great, William. Absolutely great. Yep, been a wonderful week so far. Early in the week, but it's been a great week. Very productive.
Good. Well, I know you got some recreational time with your wife on last week, and I'm sure you rested up and ready to go, and that's good.
Yeah, we went. We basically just kicked back and did a whole lot of nothing. We did go up to Sulphur, which is 30 miles north of here. Just a real short trip. There is a place up there that is owned by a husband and wife team. They're both professional trained chefs. They can make the simplest of foods seem like the most wonderful thing you've ever set tooth to, and I actually ate, for the first time in my life, I ate an elk steak. Now, it was prime quality, so that's the best you could get. So I'm sure that contributed to it being so good. But my goodness gracious, the moment I set tooth to that, I was like, okay, I found a new favorite food. This is awesome. But you talk about succulent and tasty, rich. My goodness, it was rich, but it did not taste gamey at all. And, oh, my goodness gracious, it was wonderful. Of course, it's one of those places you can only afford to go to 2 or 3 times, or, one or 2 times every 3 or 4 years, because they don't give that stuff away.
Oh, I can imagine. But it sounds like it was very good, and glad you got a chance to get away. I think Laura and I were going to take a weekend excursion this week.
Right.
Just spend a little time, so we're looking forward to that as well.
Yeah, well, you and I both do our fair share of work. That's not to brag. It's just a fact. We both work awfully hard, and our wives do as well. And there just comes a bit of time when you need a little bit of time off just to kind of reconnect and just relax. And so that's what we did. Like I said, we didn't do a whole lot of anything distinctive. We went to what's known as the Chickasha Cultural Center, which is a fantastic, it's a world quality cultural center for the Chickasha people. And I even participated in a stomp dance, William. Jan has it on film. There I was in the lineup, walking out, up on this stage, doing a stomp dance. I brought it.
We'll have to get a copy of that tape.
I broadened my horizons.
There you go.
But it was an interesting, very, very interesting center up there about the history, the culture, the artifacts, and the arts of the Chickasaw people. It really is a fascinating area. I honestly did not have any idea that it drew people from literally around the world, and so it was quite an impressive place to visit.
Well, it sounds great. It's always good to, step outside of your world and look into somebody else's and see things from their point of view and kind of experience, a different culture. That was one of the things that I appreciated when I lived in the Fort Lauderdale, Miami area. I mean, you were always coming in contact with, different cultures, and just learning things about, different people. So it's a great experience.
Yes, it is. It really is. I mean, even going to some place like Australia has its own distinctive challenges. And as you know, when we went over there, you run into Indonesians and Chinese, and you run into people from all the different cultures. And then the Australians are themselves kind of they're a people apart, and they're very proud of their past, their history. And so it's a fascinating place to be, just like it is any other place that you travel. They have their own idioms. They have their own cultural idiosyncrasies. They look upon America in a distinctive way, and we look upon them in a distinctive way. So it's good to get acclimated. It's good to learn about different people and different cultures, because sometimes it helps us appreciate them and maybe the struggles that they encounter that we're not familiar with. It helps us to appreciate their culture more than perhaps we ever have. So it's very, very good. I enjoy traveling. I really do.
Yeah, I do occasionally. I just don't like to stay a long time. That's about it with me.
Well, yeah, I agree with that. And I must confess that the older I get, the less I enjoy staying very, very long. So anyway, well, William, we've been talking about the man of sin as a sign of the end. And let me remind our listeners that this entire series is archived here on Fulfilled Radio. So if you want to go back and listen to the different programs that we have done, and it all began when President Trump said that he was going to put the American embassy in Jerusalem as recognition of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. That initiated an entire series of riots and violence, people dying. And of course, it provoked and prompted the so-called prophecy experts to declare that Donald Trump is the man of sin. And that this declaration proves beyond a shadow of a doubt, that we are in the last days, the end is near, and my goodness gracious, at the number of private messages, the number of YouTube responses that I got when I produced a 3-video response to the claims that Donald Trump is the Antichrist. I was literally just flabbergasted at the unreasonable, the illogical, the unbiblical claims that were being made about Donald Trump as a proof that we are in the last days and as proof that he is the Antichrist. I mean, William, you and I encounter this on so many different levels on almost a daily basis as we discuss Bible prophecy with futurists. The fact that they virtually ignore audience relevance, they virtually ignore the fact that the Bible is written in a very specific historical, cultural, political, religious context. And they insist that the Bible was not even concerned about those days, those times, those people. Instead, they have to do with us today. Without any doubt, it's all about us today. And I mean, it's just simply amazing, and it's sad at the same time. So what we've done, ladies and gentlemen, is over the last several weeks, a couple of months now, William and I have been discussing what are the true biblical signs of the end. What does the Bible give as the signs of the day of the Lord? And we've shared with you that without a doubt, the Bible establishes, proves irrefutably that all of those signs of the coming of the Lord, all of those signs of the last days, were present in the first century. And so when people start saying, oh, we're in the last days, we're seeing the signs of the end, they are completely guilty of ignoring the biblical testimony. And William, as you well know, 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 is considered, I suppose we could say, the foundational text to prove that the man of sin is a last days figure, a true sign of the imminence of the day of the Lord. And so here we are, 2,000 years removed from the time when Paul wrote 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, and approximately 50, some say 51 or 52 even, but certainly no later than that. And he was talking about the man of sin. And William, one of the things that we had just touched on ever so briefly, that none of the major dispensational writers ever touch, is the fact that Paul said, "Now I beseech you, brethren, by the coming of our Lord, and our gathering together to him, that you be not soon shaken in mind, whether by letter or epistle, or by word or by spirit, that the day of the Lord has already come or is already present." Now, we can talk about the translation of that. We've already talked about it a little bit. But William, here is Paul saying, don't let anyone, or we appeal to you by the parousia, the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ. Parousia, presence. We appeal to you by that and our gathering together. Okay, there's the gathering. And he uses the distinctive Greek word episynagoge. And episynagoge is a very distinctive Greek word used in the New Testament. It is only used, if memory serves me correctly, it is only used about 7 times in the New Testament. Now, what is extremely important is that episynagoge is a word that is used in the Old Testament, and it is a tremendously significant eschatological term in the Old Testament. It's one of those words, and we're not going to go into this tremendously tonight, but I'm going to look this up on Bible Hub real quickly. And folks, if you don't use Bible Hub, then let me recommend that you do so. Bible Hub is an extremely helpful resource that gives you an interlinear. In other words, it gives you the English translation, and it gives you the Greek of the text as well. And so it is very, very helpful to look up words. So first of all, episynagoge and its cognates, synagogue, sunazine, and what have you. This cognate, or this word, is used in the Old Testament. Now, it's used in very mundane manners. You know, you could gather animals together, you could gather people together, etc. It can just simply mean a literal physical gathering of people or animals or what have you. but it's also used in an eschatological sense of the end time gathering at the time of the coming of the Lord, the judgment, the resurrection, and the kingdom. It's used this way in Psalms 102 and 22, which is the time of the revealing of the Lord in glory, the time of the redemption of Zion, the time of the creation of a brand new people, and the time of the passing away of heaven and earth. And we don't have time to exegete that passage, but it also, all of this takes place at the time when you gather together the nations. So right here in Psalms 102, we have all these eschatological, soteriological tenets, and it's just incredibly important. Episunagoge and a cognate is used in Isaiah 56, in which the Lord promised to return Israel to him, to gather Israel to him under the Messiah in the Messianic temple. But then besides Israel, he would also gather the nations. And on and on and on it goes. I mean, it really honestly is an incredibly important term. By the way, I've posted just recently 2 articles on my website, donkpreston.com. I'm in the process of doing a series of articles entitled, "Was the Fall of Jerusalem the Good News of the Kingdom? And how can it be called the Good News of the Kingdom?" And the last 2 articles that I've posted are dealing with the fact that Jesus said that at the time of his coming in judgment, at the fall of Jerusalem, he would send forth his angels, and they shall gather the elect from the 4 winds. Well, that word "gather together" in Matthew 24:31 is episunagoge. So here is Jesus in Matthew 24 talking about the gathering, the episunagoge, at his coming, his parousia. Here is Paul talking about the parousia and the episunagoge in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, 1 and 2. Now, what's absolutely incredible, and William, I'd like for you to comment on this, is Paul is urging the Thessalonians not to be convinced, not to be swayed, not to be persuaded that the gathering had already taken place. So, William, if the rapture is the gathering, okay, if the rapture is the gathering, and the gathering, the rapture, is the time when all the faithful Christians in the world are suddenly snatched off of the earth. They just disappear. And yet, here's the Thessalonian church still existing. And here's Paul, an apostle of Jesus Christ, that I think we could classify as a faithful Christian. And yet Paul is having to write to the Thessalonians to tell them, "Brethren, don't let anyone convince you that the gathering, the rapture, has already taken place." William, if the rapture was, or if the gathering was the rapture, how could anybody convince the Thessalonians that the rapture had already taken place? And what would it mean to them if it had?
Yeah, I was going to say that would certainly be rather difficult because, all of them were still hanging around on earth. And yet Paul didn't treat them as though they were the unbelievers because he gave them instructions that would lead them further to a better understanding of the return of the Lord. So, it's impossible. And I was looking up the definition on Bible Hub as well as you were going through that. And one of the definitions was a gathering together in one place. So if this were a literal rapture, it would have gathered all the believers into one single place. If we're going to, look at it from that perspective, but that's just another one of the reasons why you can't look at this as as a physical rapture or as a rapture within itself, because, they were believing that it had already come, and yet their feet were flat on the earth. There were no empty, of course, if it were in our day and time, they would claim there were empty planes and empty buses and things of that nature and cars running all off the street. But none of that was taking place. These people were still on earth. They were still, very rational about what was going on. They just had a misunderstanding of the timing of the Lord's coming. And, of course, that's what Paul was correcting. But nothing of the sort of seeing people, transported into the air. And of course, they didn't have any knowledge of it. And how would it have been for them to not have seen a single person be raptured if that were the case? So it's very clear that it could not be talking about the rapture. And if that were the case, they were believing that it had already happened, and yet they were not a part of it.
Well, and not only that, if they believed that the rapture had already taken place, if they believed the day of the Lord had already taken place, they still believed that they could take the time to write Paul an epistle and say, hey, Brother Paul, what's going on? Has the day of the Lord already happened? Or if they had not written a letter to Paul, some believe they had, some believe they hadn't. But anyway, even if they had not taken the time to write a letter to Paul and to ask him if the day of the Lord had come, or it's possible that Silvanus or Titus had carried the news back to Paul that here's what they are believing. Just think about the time involved in that. I mean, he's over here at Corinth or Athens, and they're taking the time to travel all of this distance over there to report to Paul and say, Paul, the guys back there in Thessalonica are believing the day of the Lord's already come, that the rapture has already taken place. So Paul writes this letter, sends it back to them, which takes a good bit of time for travel. And you would certainly think that someone in that congregation would have begun to say, excuse me, guys, if the day of the Lord is an earth-burning event, time-ending event, how could we believe it had already happened? And somebody might go, hey, that's a good point. That's a really good point. How does anybody believe that anybody could convince anybody that the day of the Lord, as traditionally taught, a time-ending, earth-burning, cosmos-destroying event, had already taken place? I mean, how could anybody believe that had already happened? And then, if this rapture concept is accurate, how could they believe? What kind of an impact would it have had upon their own psyche to believe that the rapture, as you pointed out there, the gathering together into one venue, one location, had already happened, and yet they were still at Thessalonica with their feet firmly on the ground? Would that not demand that they were sitting around in their assembly going, the gathering together happened and we missed it, guys. What's wrong with us?
Well, not only would they have missed it, not only would they have missed it, the apostles would have too.
Paul missed it. Silvanus missed it. Titus missed it. Timothy missed it. Paul's entire inner circle. They would have believed, they would have had to have believed that Paul's entire inner circle and Paul, the apostle, and again, let me state this. I mean, I'm not trying to be facetious, but this is clearly, obviously true. Did they not believe that Paul was a righteous, holy man? And it's the most righteous, correct, that were going to be, ostensibly, according to a literal rapture doctrine, it was the righteous that were going to be snatched off of the earth. And yet they believed the rapture had already taken place, supposedly. And so, this to me is just one of the incredibly profound passages that completely falsifies and nullifies this modern dispensational doctrine of the rapture. And I have not seen, I have not heard, I have not read a single dispensational author or speaker even address this issue. Now, here's what's interesting, William. It's part of the enigma here. According to the dispensational paradigm, Matthew 24, 29 to 31 is actually the second coming of Christ. It is ostensibly after 7 years after the rapture. Because you see, in the dispensational paradigm, what you've got to have is the rapture of the church. That's the gathering. That's supposedly the episynagoge. Okay, so you've got to have the rapture. You've got to have the signing of the peace treaty between the man of sin that Paul talks about in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 and the nation of Israel. Israel rebuilds the temple in Jerusalem in 3.5 years. And as Thomas Ice says in his book, Prophecy Watch, the traditional Jewish sacrifices are restored. So in the dispensational view, you have the rapture, the man of sin, the treaty with Israel, the rebuilding of the Jerusalem temple, and then 3.5 years after the signing of the peace treaty, you have the man of sin breaking that treaty and instituting what we call the Great Tribulation. That's Matthew 24:21. You see, he sets up the abomination of desolation of Matthew 24:15, and ensues on a campaign of persecution against Israel in what's known as the Great Tribulation. And it is at the height of the Great Tribulation, immediately after the tribulation of those days, that the sun is darkened, the moon does not give its light, the stars of heaven are shaken, and they're moved out of their places, and then they see the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and they see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven in power and great glory, and the Son of Man sends forth his angels, and they shall gather together the elect. So, once again, it's important to understand that in the dispensational paradigm, Matthew 24 is talking about the second coming, after the rapture, after the man of sin, after the peace treaty, after the rebuilding of the temple, after the abomination of desolation, after or at the very height of the Great Tribulation. Then we find the coming of the Lord, the parousia, and the episynagoge. Here's what's so strange. When we come to 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, all of a sudden, the dispensationalists say that 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 is about the rapture. Even though it's the parousia, just like in Matthew 24 that the disciples asked about, tell us, when shall these things be? What shall be the sign of your coming, parousia, and the end of the age? So the disciples are asking about the parousia. Jesus is answering their question about the parousia. Now, he uses a different word. He uses erchomai in Matthew 24, 30, and 31, or 30. But there's no, erchomai is a noun, parousia is a noun, erchomai is a verb. Big deal. You cannot make a substantive delineation between parousia and erchomai, except one is a noun, one is a verb. That's just it. They're not two totally separate events, separated in time by 2,000 years or by 7 years. That type of claim simply will not stand up to a careful linguistic and contextual analysis in the various texts where these different words are used. So the dispensationalists come along and they say that parousia / erchomai and episudagogi in Matthew 24 is talking about the second coming after the rapture. But they come to 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 where the identical words are used, and they say, oh, no, that's the rapture. And getting them to explain that and to attempt to justify that rationalization or that delineation between the events is just nearly impossible. I mean, in countless discussions with dispensationalists, trying to get them to deal with this is extremely, extremely difficult. So here is Paul dealing with the first century church, urging them, do not let anyone convince you that the day of the Lord and the gathering together, i.e., the supposed rapture, has already come. Now, I suggest, William, that this is one of the most incredible threats to the entire dispensational paradigm that could possibly be imagined. For Paul to write to that first century church and say, brethren, guess what? The rapture has not occurred yet. Okay, how could they even believe that it had already occurred? How could the Thessalonians 2,000 years ago, and why would they believe that only 17 years after the establishment of the church? You know, if the rapture brings the church age to an end, which is the dispensational view of the rapture, by the way, all right? Is it not rather remarkable that anyone could believe, number one, that the rapture would bring the church age to an end, and only 17 years after the establishment of the church, those people are thinking the rapture, i.e. the end of the church age, and the end of the church had already occurred. I mean, what in the world's going on here?
It's hard to believe that they could, compress it in such a short time frame, especially, claiming that no one knows and that all these things were to take place, and yet they have all of these prophecies that are going on today, and these signs that they claim, or things that they claim are signs today, and yet you have a text, in the scriptures where they were believing that it had already come. So it's just amazing that they would even attempt to look at those things in such a short period of time and think that they could have occurred as far as this language is concerned. And at the same time, they practice a totally different point of view when they are making these predictions. So it's just, it's rather bizarre when you think about it.
Well, and let's add to this the discussion of 2 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 18, where Paul told the Ephesians to beware of Hymenaeus and Philetus, who concerning the faith have erred, teaching that the resurrection has already passed, overthrowing the faith of some. Now, William, there's not a whole lot of controversy, at least in traditional eschatology, traditional futurism. There's certainly not much discussion as to whether or not the resurrection occurs at the day of the Lord. Isn't that the accepted traditional view in traditional Christianity?
That's correct. At the day of the Lord, at the alleged end of time.
Okay, so if it's the case that the resurrection and the day of the Lord are synchronous events, and if the Thessalonians were believing that the day of the Lord had already come, then doesn't that mean that they likewise were believing that the resurrection had already come, just like the Ephesians? Are we not finding exactly the same issue in Ephesus and at Thessalonica, or are these two totally separate and distinct situations?
No, I wouldn't see them as two separate, distinct situations at all, because as you have developed and stated, if you're going to talk about the resurrection, which take 1 Corinthians 15:23, takes place at his coming, and then here we have the Thessalonians believing that the coming has already occurred, they would have to believe, since these are, synchronous events, that happen basically in the same time frame, that they would have to believe that the resurrection had occurred. I mean, that's what Paul says in 2 Timothy 4 and verse 1, that all of these events were together. I charge you before God and the Lord Jesus Christ, who is about to judge the living and the dead at his appearing and his kingdom. So there's the coming of the eternal kingdom. There's the appearing of Christ, the resurrection of the dead, and judgment, all at the same time. And it's that's another scenario. They would have to believe that everyone was gathered before Christ as well, based on their understanding of judgment, that he was separating the sheep from the goats. And yet the Thessalonians were still in Thessalonica, and everybody else was wherever they were.
Yeah, they're still over there in Ephesians or Ephesus and in Macedonia and Corinth and, wherever. It really is astounding. But, some commentators, William, try to escape the force of both 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 and 2 Timothy chapter 2 by saying, and by the way, F.F. Bruce, I never will forget reading his comments years ago, and he certainly hit it on the head. He said, it is impossible to believe that anyone could suggest or believe that the events of 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 had already occurred. And that was his rationalization and justification for rejecting the proper linguistic translation of 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. He looked at the Greek, so that the Greek word enestemi is in the perfect tense, and is taken, and not mistaken, enestaken. But he saw the proper translation, and he knew it was the proper translation, but he realized that if one accepts the proper linguistic translation, that meant that they really were believing the day of the Lord had already come. However, he, F.F. Bruce, had the traditional, literalistic, materialistic concept of the day of the Lord, that when Paul said Christ would descend from the heaven with a shout, with the voice of the archangel and the sound of the trumpet, that was literal. Jesus was going to come out of heaven as a 5'5" Jewish man riding a literal cumulus cloud with the literal sound of a trumpet, with the literal shout of the archangel, and bring the Christian age to an end. Well, obviously no one could believe that had happened. And so in a similar vein, the commentators come to 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 18, where Paul said Hymenaeus and Philetus are saying the resurrection has already passed, and they're saying, well, Hymenaeus and Philetus were saying that the spiritual resurrection had already occurred, and Paul was rejecting that. Oh, wait a minute. William, could Paul teach or deny that resurrection, that spiritual resurrection had begun?
I don't think he could deny that at all, because he certainly affirmed it in passages like Colossians 2 and Romans chapter 6.
So
even
there's
in
simply
1 Timothy.
Yeah, exactly. In 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 10, God is faithful. If we he will not deny himself. If we deny him, he will deny us. And he said, but this we believe, that if we died with him, we shall also live with him. So here is Paul affirming the past, quote, death, unquote, of the Ephesians, but he's also affirming the yet future to him consummation of that dying and rising process which had been initiated. But somehow, some way, the scholars, they understand that no one could believe. They understand that Hymenaeus and Philetus they just simply could not believe, could not be teaching, could not convince anybody that the traditional view of the resurrection, i.e., the raising of every dead human being who has ever died in the history of the earth, had already happened. They couldn't convince anybody that all the graves were now empty. Wouldn't be possible. And so they say, well, what they were doing is they were teaching that the spiritual resurrection was past. Well, Paul was affirming spiritual resurrection. These scholars are all of the time ignoring the connection between the day of the Lord and the resurrection. They're having to say that the resurrection of 2 Timothy chapter 2 is not the resurrection at the day of the Lord. Well, I don't know how you go about delineating that in the first place, because Paul anticipated the consummation of the dying and rising process that had begun in Christ. He saw that consummation as occurring at the day of the Lord. Colossians chapter 3, verses 1 and following. If then you be risen with Christ, seek those things which are above, not on things that on the earth. For you died, and your life is hidden in Christ. So here is Paul talking about a dying and rising process. And by the way, folks, I'm pretty sure most people would agree, Paul's not talking about biological death and biological life in that context, even though, strangely enough, they admit that there was a spiritual death that had taken place, a non-biological, non-material, non-physical death. You died with Christ. But then they turn around and they say, well, the life that they were waiting to be manifested was, after all, physical life. They kind of change horses in the middle of the stream and give no justification for that hermeneutic. But the fact that people try to delineate between the coming of the Lord, the day of the Lord, and the gathering of 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, and the resurrection of 2 Timothy chapter 2, is simply untenable. There's no justification for that. They are divorcing resurrection from the day of the Lord. And they're saying, well, Hymenaeus and his friends had to be talking about a spiritual resurrection, so that's unrelated to the day of the Lord. And they're forgetting that the spiritual resurrection that had already begun, Romans chapter 6, the passage you alluded to, would in fact be consummated at the day of the Lord. There is no delineation. There is no dichotomy. There is no divorcing of the day of the Lord from the resurrection, period. Whether you make resurrection in 2 Timothy chapter 2 to be spiritual or physical, you cannot divorce it from the day of the Lord. Can't be done. But that's what people try to do.
Well, that's true. I mean, it's just not possible to do that. And one of the reasons is, they just don't grasp that already but not yet concept when it comes down to the resurrection that Paul affirmed in those passages that you related. I mean, it's all through, as you said, the church at Ephesus in 2 Timothy, the Ephesians chapter 2, Colossians 2, Romans chapter 6, etc. It's there. And that is what Paul affirmed. And what's amazing is in the very chapter, as you were discussing, in the very chapter of 2 Timothy 2, in chapter 2 and chapter 4, Paul affirms the future nature and timing of the resurrection. And yet what they are claiming is that it had already passed. So it's very clear that they were not teaching the same thing that Paul taught. And yet, people go to those texts and they just read, completely around or over or under or whatever direction those two passages and ignore the context and then claim that, that's what was being taught and or that's what we teach. And it's not. We're on the outskirts of that text, on the perimeters of that text, where in 2 Timothy 4:1 and 2 Timothy 2:10 through 12, 11 and 12 particularly, that's what we're affirming. The very same thing Paul did, and within that context, then he brings up Hymenaeus and Philetus, and of course they were teaching, as we've said, the very same thing that these in Thessalonica were teaching, and therefore we've demonstrated how it could not have been the case in terms of an actual return of the Lord at that time, because of course Paul gives the signs, and as we get to those signs, and I'll wait on this, but I mean there is something so obvious in pretty much the entire paradigm of the return of the Lord that as obvious as it is, people don't make a lot of comments on it, and it's glaring at us right here in both of these texts that we're talking about and many others, but we'll get to it in time.
All right. Well, in the meantime, folks, by the way, some years ago, I wrote a book entitled, How Is This Possible? And in that book, I explore the question, how would it be possible for anyone to believe that the traditional definition of the day of the Lord, once again, an earth-burning, time-ending, cosmos-destroying event in which every person who had ever lived throughout time and had decayed, decomposed, and disappeared, whether in the sea or into the dust, was suddenly reconstituted, raised, revived, resurrected. How could anybody believe that had already taken place? And William, I have used this question. I have posed this question. You have posed this question. And one of the most common responses that we get is, well, that's not relevant. Or we get the deer in the headlight look. Or, well, they were talking about something totally different. You're the one that's saying, you're the one guilty of the Hymenaean heresy, therefore you're a false teacher. And they never addressed the question. How could anybody believe that Hymenaeus was teaching that the literal physical resurrection of every dead person who has ever lived had already taken place? You believe the resurrection is the raising of every dead person who has ever lived. Tell me how anybody could believe it had already happened. And, it seems to go over the head of some people. I don't think it really goes over the head of some people so much as it is, I think I hear my mom calling me right now. And, or if it's not my mom, it's my wife or my kids. I don't have time to discuss this anymore. and they literally disappear from the scene. Or they give some of the most ridiculous arguments that are imaginable. Some former preterists have decided that, the resurrection that Hymenaeus was affirming was past was, in fact, spiritual resurrection. That's where they're trying and how they're trying to deal with the problem. And as we've already discussed here this evening, that simply will not work. It simply will not work. You have to create all of these divisions, all of these redefinitions of resurrection and redefinitions of the day of the Lord, redefinitions of the gathering, in order to try to sustain any kind of futurist eschatology. I mean, after all, let's go back to 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. You know, William, we're told, okay, Matthew chapter 25, 31 and following, when the Son of Man shall come in his own glory, then shall he sit on the throne of his glory, and all the nations of the earth shall be gathered together before him. Now, that gathered together there in Matthew 25, 31, 32 is a cognate. It's obviously in the future tense. But it is a cognate of our word episynagoge. Here we have Matthew, or Jesus, in Matthew 24, 31, talking about the gathering. Now, here's the irony, folks. You really, really have to catch the power of this irony in both the amillennial and in the postmillennial world. We are told that Matthew chapter 24, verse 31 refers to the coming of the Lord in the judgment of Israel and Jerusalem in AD 70. Now, we have some postmillennialists, such as Gary DeMar, who believe that the gathering of Matthew chapter 24, 31 began in AD 70, and likewise believes that the gathering of Matthew 25, 31 and 32 likewise began in AD 70. Gary DeMar believes that it was the judgment of Matthew 25, 31 and following that began in AD 70 and is an ongoing judgment. It is an ongoing judgment. Well, if you take that position, number one, it is not a literal, physical, bodily gathering together in one place. Because after all, if you take it that the gathering is the gathering of individuals into the kingdom as they are converted to the Lord, you know, that happens all over the world at different times. It's not a one-time gathering of everyone to gather into one place. So that doesn't work real well. So the irony here is, for the amillennialists at least, and I would say even the majority of postmillennialists, they tell us that Matthew chapter 24, verse 31, occurred in AD 70. However, remember now, a cognate of the identical word is used in Matthew 25, 31, 32, when all the nations of earth shall be gathered before him. And you see, that's totally different. Even though in Matthew 24, 31, we have the gathering together of the elect from the four winds, well, isn't that all the nations of the earth? But that's AD 70. But they come to Matthew 25, 31, and they tell us, well, no. That's got to be the end of time, and that's a literal gathering. Well, what's the difference between the gathering of the elect from the four winds in Matthew 24, 31 and the gathering of the nations? Isn't that the gathering from the four winds in Matthew 25, 31? So if the gathering of Matthew 24, 31 is the AD 70 gathering, why isn't the gathering of Matthew 25, 31 and 32 that identical gathering? And the reason we are told is because, the disciples asked about two different events. They asked about the coming of the Lord in AD 70, and they asked about the end of time coming of the Lord. No, they didn't. They asked about no such distinct, separate events. It is literally a myth and a fable and a theological invention to suggest that the disciples were asking about a literal, visible, physical coming of Jesus at the end of the Christian age. That is not a biblical doctrine. And by the way, in the upcoming Preterist Pilgrim Weekend, July 12th through 14th, 2018, of course, I will be dealing with Matthew chapter 24 and the disciples' questions as to whether or not Matthew 24 and 25 contain two different subjects. Does Matthew 24 and 25 discuss AD 70 and the end of the world? Does it discuss a spiritual coming of Christ through the agency of the Romans and a prediction of the coming of Christ as a 5'5" Jewish man in a physical body riding a physical cumulus cloud at the end of the current Christian age? Now, folks, that's the traditional view of modern Christianity of the amillennial and the postmillennial world. That's basically the Reformed view. It was popularized by Lorraine Bettner. It was the view and is the view of most of the leading postmillennialists and amillennialists to this day, although you're finding, strangely enough, an increasing number of amillennialists who are just incredibly, and I say this with as much kindness as possible, but they are exhibiting more confusion about the Olivet Discourse than is imaginable. It's just staggering, the amount of confusion that's being exhibited in the amillennial world. You have men such as Kim Riddlebarger, who admits that, well, yeah, there was a coming of the Lord in AD 70, but it was typological of the real end of the current Christian age. And that view is gaining popularity for some strange reason. So, all of that said, all right, we go back to the idea, and we go back to the fact that, as we've hinted at but not stated specifically, in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, Paul is drawing directly from Matthew chapter 24. He has the exact same terminology, the same linguistics, the same themes, and the same motifs. Jesus was emphatic in Matthew 24 in positing those things in that generation. Matthew 24, verse 34. Verily I say unto you, and that's from the little Greek term, amin lego humin, and that little term is used throughout the entirety of the New Testament, and it never breaks a subject. It never introduces a new subject. It emphasizes a discussion that is either explicitly in view or implicitly in the context. And so here is Jesus, after talking about his coming on the clouds, power and great glory, and by the way, according to Luke chapter 21, 28 to 31, the coming of the kingdom, and the time of redemption, Jesus says that this gathering, this episynagoge at the day of the Lord would occur in his generation. Again, verily I say unto you, this generation will by no means, he uses a double negative, will by no means pass away until all of these things shall be fulfilled. And so, if it is true that the parousia of 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 is the same parousia of Matthew 24, and if it is true that the episynagoge of Matthew 24 is the episynagoge of 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, then we have Jesus emphatically saying his generation would not pass until all of those things were fulfilled. It is incredibly powerful testimony, and yet, as William says, there are some things lying on the surface of 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 and 2 Timothy chapter 2 that is seldom, if ever, noticed by futurists. Seldom, if ever. So, guess what? Next week, William's going to share that with us and develop that for us very carefully. You'll want your Bibles handy. You'll want your notebooks handy as we continue to discuss the signs of the end the signs that were present in the first century, and the emphatic statements of the Lord that the coming of the Lord, the judgment, the resurrection, the gathering, i.e., the rapture, was to occur in the first century. And guess what? With that, we are out of time. Folks, thank you so very, very much for joining us this evening on Two Guys and a Bible here on Fulfilled Radio, a voice you can trust. Join us again next week. Invite your friends to join with you, and we'll look forward to seeing you then. In the meantime, good night, and God bless.
Thank you for joining the Two Guys and a Bible radio broadcast. On behalf of Dunn Preston and myself, we'd like to say, have a very pleasant day, and may God bless. Until next time, we'll see you on Fulfill Radio, a voice you can trust.